This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
I am Charlotte Casseraghi, and in partnership with the House of Chanel, I present to you the Les Rencontres podcast. As part of the Rendez-vous littéraire at Rue Cambon, this podcast spotlights the birth of a female writer. You can listen to the various episodes and their authors on your preferred streaming platforms.
This week on the podcast, Spark and Fire, composer Chris Bowers.
The power of music is how quickly it can make you feel something.
To compose the award-winning series When They See Us, Chris used his emotion as his North Star.
I would watch that scene, the feelings were so visceral, made me bawl my eyes out.
On Spark and Fire, creators share their stories to fuel your creativity. Spark and Fire is a Wait What original in partnership with the BBC. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Anarchy in the UK and beyond on this edition of the Arts and Ideas podcast. Join me, Matthew Sweet, and guests for thoughts on how to live life without top-down power after this message.
Switch up your listening with the classical mixtape on BBC Sounds. Lovingly produced 30-minute mixes of classical, jazz, folk and world music with no talking. The perfect soundtrack for any time of day. Search for Classical Mixtape on BBC Sounds now to subscribe and listen to dozens of recent episodes. Take it away.
Hello, freethinkers. There's a bit in Vladimir Nabokov's novel Pnin when the hero arrives at Ellis Island from Russia and is asked by an immigration official, "Are you an anarchist?" Well, Pnin says, what do we understand under anarchism? Does the official mean anarchism practical, metaphysical, theoretical, mystical, abstractional, individual, social? And then they have a discussion that goes on for 2 weeks. We haven't got quite that long. We've got 45 minutes and 3 contributors to tell us what they understand under anarchism and where they see its currents flowing today. And they'll do that partly in reference to a fourth person who can't take part in our discussion, the anarchist, activist and anthropologist David Graeber, who died young and suddenly in 2020. You might know his head-spinning work of history, The Dawn of Everything, co-written with his friend, the archaeologist David Wengrow, who I'm happy to say is with me now. Hello, David.
Hi.
Graeber has a new book out posthumously, a thrillingly imaginative account of the legend and the truth of Libertalia, a pirate democracy said to have flourished in 18th century Madagascar. And I said we had 3 guests. The other 2 are Kirsten Stevens-Wood, ethnographer, and Sophie Scott-Brown, historian of anarchism and biographer of Colin Ward, an important 20th century anarchist thinker who loved that Nabokov moment because, as everybody in this room knows, I nicked it from one of his books. Now, nobody is going to get their passport stamped here, but we can't let our main term pass by unexamined. So who's going to go first? What is anarchism, Sophie?
Oh, for me, anarchism is a way of thinking rooted in an ethical commitment to extending liberty to everyone.
That's nice and aphoristic, David.
Gosh, I don't think I've ever used the term in my own writing, and the only time I can think that it crops up in my work with David is when we're citing other authors who use it in a completely incorrect way to mean sort of the advocacy of violence or total social breakdown. But yeah, I mean, I guess my basic understanding of anarchism is that it's the theory and practice of human social life outside the state and outside chains of command and punitive systems of law.
So without coercion.
Without coercion.
Kirsten.
I would build on that in that most of my research revolves around people who are practicing different forms of independent living and trying to move slightly away from state. And I would probably frame it along the lines of freedom from state, not in its biggest sense, but maybe freedom and independence from the state. Yeah.
Now there was anarchy before there were anarchists. And I wonder whether the word is marked by its life as a kind of pejorative, David.
Oh, yeah, I think this is undoubtedly the case. I mean, it's been very striking to me how people who aren't particularly fans of the work I've done with David will use the label anarchist.
Oh, really? As a kind of
Yeah. I mean, although it's the book isn't characterized in that way because, of course, if you think about it, human life going on outside the state is a very large part of human history. And it would be a bit reductionist to sort of reduce it all to things written in Europe since the 19th century. The basic principles, things like mutual aid, consensus process, you can find in so many different cultural permutations that don't come from the European tradition. So I think that's one of the reasons why we ourselves would never characterize what we've done as an anarchist history or anything like that. But interestingly, people who aren't particularly keen on the work go straight to the label. So I think there is a sense
because
in
of that
true.
history, I suspect. I mean, we can find anarchy in Milton's Paradise Lost. Here's a good bit. Before their eyes in sudden view appear the secrets of the hoary deep, a dark illimitable ocean without bound, without dimension, where length, breadth and height and time and place are lost, where eldest night and chaos, ancestors of nature, hold eternal anarchy amidst the noise of endless wars, and by confusion stand. That's the idea that might get thrown at you, is it then, Sophie?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, anarchism in its sort of rawest sense, as David's saying, it's got a long prehistory before it was a kind of capital A anarchist proper noun for a particular ideological movement or set. And anarchism simply means anarchism, from the Greek, which means without a state, without permanent government. And this idea, and like exactly as you started the programme with, it's got so many combinations, permutations, which is why I always sort of tend to hedge my bets a bit and settle on it being a kind of way of thinking, a way of seeing, being and acting within the world. And of course, you've got to remember that people, who have a sort of strong vested interest in maintaining order, perhaps because that order suits or upholds, their particular position in the world, their sets of privileges. Well, of course, the easiest thing in the world is to denigrate or sneer at something that you're quite afraid of.
Let's open up that history a bit, because we can find anarchy in Milton, but as your subject, Colin Ward, observed, you can also find it in Milton Keynes. So where did he find it in Milton Keynes?
Well, Colin Ward was his particular approach to anarchism was, again, it can be found in many, many different places. It can be found in very unexpected places. I mean, the wonderful thing about David Graeber's book, Pirate Enlightenment, is that we do, part of the joy of that is discovering anarchism in some way you'd think a very unlikely, unexpected place. Arguably, Colin Ward took this to even greater heights because he found anarchism in the most unusual places. One thing he looked at quite a lot was the idea of new towns. And the new town experiment had a very strong utopian sort of a vibe about it, because here's the practical project. How do you create a brand new sense of community where people feel like they belong, that they identify with, that they connect with, out of literally nothing? How do you, what are the processes, what are the mechanisms that you go through, and how do you make people feel that it actually belongs to them rather than it's being something they're inserted into? So the new towns was something that Colin was certainly very, very interested in, but not unskeptically so.
And we should say he was a town planner. That was his day job, wasn't it?
Well,
so why was that a good profession for an anarchist?
Well, I mean, so Colin he was an architect's assistant. So he had a very strong vested interest in things like housing, and obviously one of his great heroes, the Russian anarchist thinker Peter Kropotkin, was always very adamant that the revolution started when everyone was fairly and decently housed. So there's a sort of strong link there. Then Colin worked for the Town and Country Planning Association, which was the association that emerged out of the Garden City movement from Ebenezer Howard. And he was the education officer there. And therefore, it was less sort of town planning in and of itself that he was interested in, more town planning as a form of anarchist education, and the idea that it involves so many different factors, so many different interests, so many different stakeholders, and these have to be kind of reconciled or brought into conversation with one another. And that very process of how you converge the practical and the idealistic that element in town planning was exactly the element he thought needed promoting in order to make anarchism as a sort of way of being a more practical possibility.
So we've got Peter Kropotkin into the conversation, clearly a towering figure in this field. And Sophie, you've mentioned his ideas about property. In his 1892 book, The Conquest of Brett, he writes about how property will be expropriated and divided up fairly. And it sounds like this will all happen quite happily without much fuss, really, doesn't it? What sort of picture does he portray, Kirsten?
Thinking about how Kropotkin's vision might have moved into reality, that transition from theory to reality, he was very sceptical about the fact that it couldn't take place in sort of very small, isolated communities, and it had to be on a minimum of a sort of citywide and possibly even nationwide, because otherwise without that you get the constraints of the state imposing their will against the communities they're set up. And I know that a lot of the intentional communities that I study, that's a real rubbing point for them. So they initially put these ideas into motion. They want to live independently. Quite a lot of it is these themes that you will find in Kropotkin and various other writers, including Colin Ward, actually, about back to the land. You know, if you can have access to land, if you can grow your own food, if you can sustain yourself in an independent way, then that will enable you to become more independent and self-sustaining through mutual aid, through communal endeavour.
Aid is a big buzzword for Kropotkin.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
can we sort of sketch in what that means?
Something you see all the time. So the idea is, rather than relying on the state, rather than sort of looking to the state for sustenance or for governance, that mutual aid is about people creating those mechanisms within and between each other. So lots of intentional communities, especially when they first start up, and possibly if we look back historically to maybe sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s, what we saw was this movement back to the land and people setting up what we would have called at the time communes. Yeah. So this idea of moving away from the state, but I would say that intentional communities constantly butt up against this. So even more modern intentional communities are trying things like to be independent in terms of their energy use. They will instigate new ideas like solar and PV, and some of them are actually off grid entirely. But what happens is that the regulation, which is created through state mechanisms, then impedes their ability to be able to separate completely.
I want to explore the processes of those communities soon, but I want to just stay with Kropotkin and his ideas for a bit longer, and maybe use him to answer the question, are anarchists always revolutionaries? Because Kropotkin sounds a little bit of scepticism about some revolutionary projects, I think.
You know, the idea of revolution as this kind of violent, enormous overturning of the social order is a very limiting way to think about social change. And I think this is one of the points that we try to make in The Dawn of Everything, is that we don't have to confine our thinking about radical social change to just the last few centuries of global history. We have this much bigger reservoir of knowledge these days to draw upon, which is full of examples of people transforming their social orders in much less dramatic and violent ways, but nevertheless radical and effective.
But that was the drama of Kropotkin's lifetime, wasn't it, Sophie? Is that why we might go to him for a kind of critique of that kind of sudden revolution?
Yes, I mean, Peter Kropotkin's a sort of interesting figure in the sense that, yes, he's situated towards the end of a sort of 19th century, a very turbulent century. You've seen the failure of the 1848 revolutions, and then obviously it's coming into the beginning of the 20th century, and you've got things like the Russian Revolution. So there are sort of two sides to Kropotkin. We've got to remember that he was a scientist, but he was also an anarchist thinker, but he was also an anarchist propagandist. So you've got to read a bit carefully. It depends what
very
sort
good writer as well.
He's a fantastic writer, really, really fantastic. And so there will be points where it sounds like that Kropotkin is advocating for the kind of conventional understanding of revolution that we're familiar with, namely, you know, sort of the workers flock to the barricades and all hell breaks loose, and then afterwards it's fine because we build our nice communities and it's groovy. On the other hand, in some of his more finer grained stuff, particularly his more scientifically orientated things like thinking that stemmed from mutual aid, things like that, you find a far more nuanced account of revolution. And that is, anarchism, I would say, is always revolutionary in the sense that it rejects standing orders of things, because the idea is that any sort of fixed order of any form sooner or later becomes tyrannical. It's a closed system. It's going to descend into sort of tyranny and chaos. Therefore, anarchism's always, essentially, in one definition, it's always a challenge to established order.
Colin Ward liked this metaphor of anarchist seeds beneath the snow, didn't he? Ready to germinate. Can we square that with another idea that's associated with anarchism through the work of Noam Chomsky, who would say that at the local level and in our everyday lives, we're sort of doing anarchism all the time, that we are perhaps anarchists by instinct in our everyday lives. Would they have agreed on this? Is this the same idea, or are they different, these ideas?
No, I think actually there's a lot of sympathy between those ideas. I mean, for someone like Colin and Noam Chomsky, what they're wanting to bring attention to is that anarchism, and this goes back to things that David was saying earlier, it's not quite so bloodthirsty and outlandish as people like to think. I mean, if you just strip it down to its sort of simple conceptual principles about, well, how do we organise our lives without having superimposed sort of authority structures over the top of us? So actually, and it might seem very, very trivial, almost silly, but the number of decisions that you've made just today, just this morning, in fact, or, this afternoon, wherever it might be, that you've managed to sort of work things out, make decisions between groups of friends, within your family, with work colleagues, without the need for some sort of superimposing order over the top, and that might seem small scale. And the simple argument is, well, OK, that's absolutely fine on a very trivial basis. But the point that people like Colin and Noam Chomsky want to put across is you're capable. The capability's there, the capacity's there, the skills are there. It's not that far of a reach to upscale. I mean, that's what, to go back to your point about town planning, Matthew, I mean, that's a series of trivial decisions, really, about small things scaled up. That's what it is. I mean, our lives are that wonderful blend of the trivial that suddenly is also the incredibly important.
So who here will say, I am an anarchist?
I will. Go on then.
So that's what that's the customs official that asked the question. What do you say, Kirsten?
Ooh, maybe leaning.
Yes.
I've got a complete aversion to labels.
Well, general, this is the thing. Now, this is the thing, isn't it?
Because you may say that's a very anarchist thing in itself, but whatever. But no, I won't label myself.
Too anarchist to be an anarchist.
I think we should explore that, because I suspect that being an anarchist might make you distrust such simple statements as, I am an anarchist. Fair enough?
Yes.
One of the points David used to often make, by way of contrast, or maybe to slightly sort of needle Marxists, is that there is a sort of history in Marxism, by contrast, of following these kind of heroic thinkers. So you end up with these acrimonious debates between Maoists and Trotskyites and
Trotskyites, David, showing your colours there.
This would be a very, as I understand it, a very un-anarchist, thing to do.
David Graeber, an anarchist? Would he describe himself as such?
Well, you would need to ask him, and unfortunately we can't.
So we should say he was a scholar, that he was associated with the Occupy movement. Where would you put him in the history of this thought, if I can put it like that?
Well, I think he'd sort of rather hate that very idea. I mean, one thing he did say very publicly, I think it was even on his Twitter handle, is, don't call me an anarchist anthropologist, because it's not an identity for me. It's very much, as Sophie was saying, it's something that's sort of hardwired into your tiny interactions with people. Can you achieve a particular end without putting somebody under some sort of coercive pressure?
Well, let's talk about his new book, and it seems an extraordinary thing to be saying about a person who left us a little while ago. But it's called Pirate Enlightenment. What does he propose, David?
Well, Pirate Enlightenment, he's very explicitly developing a project that he started with an essay in 2007 called There Never Was a West. And the subtitle is Democracy Emerges in the Spaces in between, I think. I mean, it's basically about what happened along a 400-ish mile stretch of coastland along the east coast of Madagascar in the early 18th century. So this is an area with a very distinctive population called the Betsimisaraka or Zanamalata, who have very distinctive origins that come out of a mixture with European seafarers, including a large number of pirates who settled there from the Caribbean or elsewhere. And in the early 18th century, as I understand it, they formed a confederation under a leader called Ratsimilaho, whose father was an English pirate who is said to have founded a kind of utopian settlement where he took the highly democratic anti-authoritarian practices that were prevalent on pirate ships and transferred them to a settlement on land. And in the book, as I see it, David's making kind of two rather specific points and one very general one, which subsequently we went on to develop in The Dawn of Everything. So the first specific point would be that the kind of democratic experiments going on pirate ships on the east coast of Madagascar fired the imagination of writers in Europe who we now credit with coming up with very similar ideas in the Age of Enlightenment. That's point number one. Point number two is that those experiments were very much the outcome of cultural mixtures between European and non-European, in this case, Malagasy populations. And then the broader argument would be that actually that kind of process was not at all unusual in the late 17th and early 18th century. As people like the historian Paul Hazard pointed out, 70 years ago in the crisis of the European mind, what we now call the Age of Enlightenment was really the outcome of this extraordinary global crisscrossing of currents of intellectual thought, many of which, particularly the non-European ones, tend to get sort of written out in official versions.
So it asks us to bring all this back into the story of a period we think we know. But what's so thrilling about this is that it's partly a history of rumours and dreams, the stories that said that there was this community that had grown up in this area that didn't need these hierarchized ways of living into which many of its participants would have been born. Why is this fantasy element important, Sophie, as important as what you might want to call harder parts of the historical record?
Utopia is a fantastic energy. I mean, in some ways, arguably, that is its primary value. It's sort of almost like a big thought experiment. And it's useful in two senses. Firstly, it registers a sort of critique, that if you're attracted or drawn to utopias, then there's something that you're not satisfied with or not accepting as inevitable in your sort of present experience. And the second is then sort of playing through, well, all right, then how else? How else might it be? What else might it be? And I think the notion of pirates, again, are sort of bound up with that. So there's utopia on the one hand, but then in this particular instance, there's the attractive notion of the pirate. The pirate is this sort of figure that falls in between the gaps. They sort of live outside and on the edges of sort of fixed, ordered legal systems. You know, they are forced, therefore, to pay more attention to their interpersonal relationships with one another because they're outside of the law. And so this is sort of a very rich, fertile image to sort of think with and play with and test out ideas with.
The book in part follows the grain of The Dawn of Everything, I think, which argues that historians and archaeologists may have missed evidence of non-hierarchical societies in the past because of their own prejudices and because of the nature of the sources. Could you kind of tease at that for us?
In that sense, although there's almost no archaeology in pirate enlightenment, it's kind of in that spirit of forcing us to think about the enormous biases in the nature of our source material, the huge sort of vistas of human history that we just know nothing about, but which we tend to sort of flatten out and assume nothing of any great interest was going on. And I think, the power of David's argument is partly that he spent many, many years doing field work work in Madagascar. So he can bring his experience and his internal understandings of that culture to bear on these very threadbare historical sources.
That sort of speaks to our experience of going to the museum and looking at the tablet or whatever, and assuming that this is some kind of rather a kind of exciting object. And it always turns out to be like a bill for something,
well,
doesn't it?
Museums, I think,
anarchists don't invoice, do they? So
no.
Is this an indication of what might be missing from
I think
the record and
museums are responsible for a lot in terms of reinforcing this rather statist notion of the human history, as if the whole globe has always been sort of carved up between these great powers with nothing going on in between.
So archaeologists and historians have been doing their work and sort of saying, like those spaceship captains in sci-fi, take me to your leader, when perhaps there wasn't one.
Well, that's a difficult one to say, but I know that non-hierarchical formations of groups is quite a common underpinning, especially for groups of people who choose to live together. So like Sophie was saying about this, paying more attention to their own relationships and the way in which those relationships take place. And interestingly, when you were just saying about no receipts, the oldest intentional community in Britain is the Whiteway colony.
Where's that?
Just outside the Cotswolds. In fact, I was there a couple of weeks ago.
And when did they flourish? Who were they?
Well, they're nearly 125 years ago, but when they bought their piece of land, so they bought about 40 acres and a farmhouse in order to live collectively, and they named themselves as anarchists. Their first act was that they set fire to and burned the deeds to their property in order to free them from the state, which was an incredibly utopian act of kind of rebellion, and this is where we are. However, it has caused them all sorts of difficulties as time has elapsed, but they're still here. Yeah. They're probably a lot more mainstream than they were 125 years ago, but yeah.
So how can anarchism furnish tools for doing history or archaeology? How are you using it?
I mean, another key point about the pirate example, which extends into our other work, is about what you might call counter power, because of course maritime life in general at that time was incredibly brutal and authoritarian and hierarchical. And my understanding is that what went on some pirate ships is that they developed a kind of counterculture to that, where executive power would be divided up between the captain and the quartermaster, and there was an overarching council of sailors that could outvote them, written agreements for dividing up the spoils and loot and that sort of thing. And this idea of counterpower is also an analytical tool, I guess, that we deploy a lot in The Dawn of Everything. And it's really the very simple idea that people consciously construct social and political systems in opposition either to what's come before, in conscious opposition perhaps to something that's just over the horizon, what your neighbours are up to, or something that doesn't exist yet, something that may be projected in the imagination into the future. And I think we're sort of taught to believe that very capacity is something that was created in the European Enlightenment with the spirit of the laws and Montesquieu. So you end up writing the rest of human history in this weird sort of as-if mode, as if most people were utterly incapable of doing that sort of thing. But as we try to show in The Dawn of Everything, actually, if you look at the evidence of human social arrangements as far back as we can take them, even back to the last ice age, you see all of these radical, quirky twists and turns that can't possibly be the result of anything but people designing their social arrangements on some kind of moral principle. And that often seems to take place without any obvious evidence for overlords or a class system or anyone sort of leading from above.
What about for the ethnographer, Kirsten? How does anarchism actually inform your methodology? It's not just the object of your study, but how is it there in your method, if it is?
Actually, ethnography also leans slightly towards that, because it doesn't allow itself to be shaped by the ethnographer themselves. I know that one throws oneself onto the mercy of the organisation or the people that you're studying. So, for example, when I've been carrying out my own research, it has very much needed to be an open page where I have allowed myself to be buffeted along by that kind of open to how it will go and where it's going to take me. And I think that the two sit together quite nicely because, of course, it's, ethnography is inherently embedded in people's experiences and their lived experiences and their knowledge about who they are and where and why they're doing what they're doing. So it's not for me to impose my interests and research on any given community. It's more a case of them telling me and me being open to that.
What's the historian's answer, Sophie?
Well, I think I'd like to sort of pick up on what Kirsten was just saying there. In some ways, Alexander Hertzin, who was a sort of another 19th century Russian who sort of came up with some interesting ideas. But he used to talk about this idea of being very open to improvisation, the intellectual improvisation, and that being anarchism less being a sort of set of concepts or categories which you have to sort of go in looking for, although, as David was saying, having an eye for that counterculture and having an openness to what else might constitute a counter culture is very useful. But I really like this idea that anarchism trains you intellectually to improvise and to sort of go with things and to continually sort of pick yourself back up and sort of say, well, how else might I see this? How else might I see this?
How, though, do you guard against fantasizing your own position into the source material, David? I'm just thinking of examples from the past, like Thor Heyerdahl, who wrote fantastically seductive books about pre-literary cultures. And they were mainly dreams, weren't they? Talk to anybody from the Maldives about his book, The Maldive Mystery. You'll get a right earful.
Yeah, it's maybe unnecessary to point out that this is kind of our bread and butter. We're both university academics. We have PhD students and all the rest of it. So we're not going to go out there and sort of make stuff up because it's difficult to go into work in the morning. So, you have to do the research, the careful research. I think the real mystery is why anyone ever would have believed the other version, which is that our ancestors were sort of either these Hobbesian brutes or these sort of childish but rather charming idiots that Rousseau imagined. That's a fantasy, and actually what we're doing a lot of the time in our work is sort of exposing it to the glare of evidence.
This is Free Thinking on BBC Radio 3 and BBC Sounds with me, Matthew Sweet, considering anarchy in the UK and beyond. If this is your vibe, then may I suggest you might also enjoy our shows on the French theorist Deleuze and Guattari and on Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. I can't force you, though, of course. Now, David Graeber was famously involved with the Occupy movement. Do we see anarchist ideas in play in contemporary protest movements like Extinction Rebellion or its offshoots Insulate Britain or Just Say No to Oil? Where do you detect that in the contemporary landscape? Kirsten?
Well, I know that we do see a lot of this idea of non-hierarchical decision-making and governance inside different types of communities. So there's these ideas around things like consensus decision-making, which is much more about this sort of flat, non-hierarchical decision-making. Some people say it's quite, it can be quite complex because it's actually not about majority rule. It's about finding a solution that is acceptable to everyone who's part of that decision in much, much bigger groups. So, for example, in places like Occupy Wall Street, I understand that there was a use of things like affinity groups.
What's that?
Well, it's like where different stakeholders might be present, and they might be present in quite large numbers. So you have a central sort of forum where people send in their ideas. They're put to the forum, and then they come back out. That's a very simplistic version of it. And actually those affinity groups may represent different agendas and different ideas, but that everybody gets an opportunity to have their voice heard, and that those are considered to be this sort of non-hierarchical governance and decision-making.
What do you think, Sophia? Are some of those groups I've mentioned, could we identify those as anarchist organisations?
Again, sort of moving carefully with the label, and obviously some of those individuals involved would happily say, yes, I'm an anarchist, and others would go, oh, I don't know, I've never thought about it, and others would say very, very firmly no. But in terms of generally coming at this, I think, again, it's coming back to that very protean definition of anarchism anarchism that you beautifully supplied us with at the beginning. Some in terms of the way they're practicing as groups, absolutely. They will sort of prefigure the kind of democracies that they'd ultimately like to see. Others of them possibly less kind of deliberately. I mean, if you take groups like Insulate or Just Say No to Oil, they probably aren't giving huge amounts of thought to, what they're prefiguring. But the instincts they display are quite anarchistic in the sense that they've come together, and they might have vastly different worldviews or beliefs as groups, people outside of the particular issue that they're focusing on, but they've come together, they've organised, they've worked out a campaign. Their idea is quite specific, but at the same time it's got a larger social purchase, and they execute it, and then they disperse and they're free to go off and be whoever they are off in their other lives.
And how do you read the relationship between such groups and the state? Because some of them are campaigning to try and get the state to do something, aren't they?
I mean, obviously anarchism, sort of a fundamental definition or sort of strand is going to be this sort of anti-statist position. On the other hand, you can say again, if we're going to accept this more malleable, flexible definition of anarchism, that anarchism basically is always seeking to sort of maximise the capacity for liberty that people have. And there are groups of people that choose to approach this very pragmatically. And the reality is we live in currently, and I think, Kirsten, this goes back to what you were saying about the situation many intentional communities find themselves in. Practically speaking, we live in a system where everything is centralised. If you're going to completely refuse that and go off-grid and underground, that's fine, but you're not going to impinge much on the wider social consciousness. So if you're going to call for the government today, who is in the position, and deliberately so, and holds the power to do things like enforce insulation in all new build housing or what have you, that doesn't mean that you're not ultimately committed to coming away from sort of an overarching impositional state. It means that you're actually thinking, right, step one today, what I can do today is say, well, we'll all be better off if we have better produced homes. What you might then try for tomorrow, that's a different question.
Kirsten, let's talk about the intentional communities that you study. We've sort of got a definition of what they are, but could you give us a sense of like the decision-making processes within an example that you could bring to us?
Okay.
How are they run?
Okay, so they are very broad. So they could go all the way through from sort of quite radical groups of people that perhaps are maybe even squatting, all the way through to sort of much more acceptable, socially acceptable mainstream versions, which is maybe something like co-housing. But what they all have in common is this choice by people to live together collectively, to share resources, sometimes land, quite often buildings, occasionally they share their income sharing, and those sorts of things. And one of the things about the decision making is very much that there's nobody at the top. There is no single decisive mechanism for one person to take control.
So we're talking about a really wide variety of communities here. I mean, we could live next door to one without really even knowing that there was anything particularly radical going on.
Yeah, they are all over the place, and people don't realise they're there. I think Diggers and Dreamers produce an annual directory, and I think there's over...
What's Diggers and Dreamers?
They're a group of editors who bring together usually community writing by communities themselves and by other types of writers. But I was really, what I was thinking about actually when I was listening to David and Sophie was these ideas of overthrowing the state versus this sort of micro in what happens in the cracks between the state and society. And actually, I would suggest that a lot of intentional communities do inhabit some of those really interesting spaces, which are the cracks in between. So they have flourished and thrived in those spaces within the constraints that they are under. So exactly as you just described, Sophie, they, a lot of them have to pay their water bill, and then they have to have a named person, or they have to have a constitution. And those communities, and they do exist, that have rejected all of those things, they cannot be publicly out there. They have to hide. Because they're
not paying tax, they're not paying that sort of thing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so you have this spectrum of groups of people who are trying to do these different experiments by becoming self-sufficient or creating these systems of mutual aid. And at the same time, they have to navigate how invested or uninvested they will be into those state mechanisms.
Just give us a sense of how conflicts are resolved in a group like this. How does it work? This is whether it's about something more serious than who's going to do the washing up tonight.
So they do vary according to their size and their shape and their democratic structures. But as a general rule, I would say most of them have committed to something that is very similar to consensus decision making. Then the simple things like the washing up tends to have its own kind of way of doing things. But let's say something came up and there was a sort of a divide within the community. Then what tends to happen is that will go to a central group. It will be discussed. It has to be discussed in the context of the community. So usually community members are asked to, if they can, put their personal reservations to one side and to think about how this affects the whole as opposed to the individual. And then if that doesn't find a resolution in that space, then quite often what groups will do is they will then put together a focus group or a breakout group, and they will take that issue out of the sort of mainstream decision making and put it into a sort of a more focused group where they can really think about that. And anybody who wants to be part of that group can, but it's quite often it's the stakeholders of, the people who are for and the people who are against. And then the other
I'm
thing...
interested in that idea of some people opting out because what you describe, it sounds terribly time consuming. It sounds like it would do a lot of the work of the community might be this process.
It can be very time consuming. Yeah, but I think one of the underpinning principles of it as well is that there is almost a duty of care to be open to reaching a conclusion. So it's very unacceptable to come to something and say, I just don't want it. What it would be more acceptable would be to say, I can accept this in this way or in these ways, and for people to come to the table with a solution as much as they're coming with an objection. That doesn't always happen, and it has been known for huge divides to create splits.
My instinct, and it may be wrong, would be to say that these groups would consider themselves to be on the left. But is there a right-wing anarchism? How does it map onto libertarianism? What's the overlap here? So how do these things help me? How do these things map together?
Okay, sure. We'll give it a go. So it sort of slips slightly back to what David was saying earlier about the slipperiness of some of our categories and labels for things. So the right in itself is not one thing, and in fact, sort of groups that might both identify as right inclined might have extremely different perceptions or views about things. But let's say the libertarian approach to sort of the market or market economy or something like that, or the libertarian account given by Hayek or that sort of thing. That's anarchist in the sense that it wants to hand over power to an impersonal sort of force, if you like, the market, and the sort of theory there being, and I'm no expert here, but the theory there being that the market is going to be your finest barometer of human desires and needs, and therefore, you don't need to have any sort of regulation of that, and that in fact is skewing or distorting kind of accurate reading of human interactions or human needs, wants, are. Problem with that, of course, is that the leftist critique of that would be, you're not going to get an accurate reading of the market whilst you start from a basis of inequality, because obviously the people who can are going to protect their advantage, and the people who can't are never going to get up to any sort of level playing field. So you're never going to be able to use the market as a fair barometer of the human condition. Equally, there is a sort of another sort of right libertarian account, which is a bit more, we would identify that slightly more with something like the organic community, and this idea that we don't need to have these sorts of superficial technocratic structures dumped on top of us, and this very kind of fictive approach to sort of history and utopia and nostalgia. There is a very fine line. One might say that nostalgia is the kind of right-wing version of utopia in some respects, but it's this idea that there was a sort of idealized perfect social order that somehow got distorted or disrupted or corrupted by the industrial, modern project, the Enlightenment project, no less, and that actually if we just sort of dig our way back, we can find this order which doesn't need to be legislated by the technicians of government that we currently have.
David Wengrow.
I think a lot of this really hinges on how we define freedoms. I certainly think that the kind of hyper-individualistic libertarianism that one sees, not just in the US, but very prominently there, has nothing to do with anarchist principles as I understand them. It's really about asserting one's personal freedoms within the limits of the law, but effectively saying, as with the gun lobby or anti-maskers, well, the rest of you can go to hell. As I understand it, it's got nothing to do with anarchism. So the anarchist concept of freedom, as I understand it, would always be about social rather than purely individual freedoms, where one's relationships and responsibilities to others are always baked in. So it's freedoms that also enable others to be free.
What would living in an anarchist society require you to relinquish, Kirsten?
I don't think I would frame it as giving things up, actually. I think I would frame it as what would be seen to be gained. You know, as David just said, it's, you know, looking at those relationships that we can have and our responsibilities to each other as human beings, possibly be looking at them outside of the paradigm of a capitalist society and the profit imperative, and starting to look at our relationships and what we can provide and give to each other. You know, there's a lot of stereotypes, isn't there, about sort of hair shirts and you know, sort of having to eat raw food every day. But actually, the communities that I come involved with, they have incredibly rich lives.
My thanks to all of you, Sophie Scott-Brown, Kirsten Stevenswood and David Wengrow, and to the producer Luke Mulhall. Sophie's book, Colin Ward and the Art of Everyday Anarchy, David's book, co-written with David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, and David Graeber's posthumous book, Pirate Enlightenment, are all out now while capitalism lasts. In this space soon, programmes on debt, decadence and Albania. So step this way.
Hey, this is Sam. Every week on Talk Easy with Sam Fragoso, I invite an activist, artist, or politician to come to the table and speak from the heart in ways you probably haven't heard from them before. Some of my favorite talks are with Lorde, George Saunders, Ilhan Omar, and Fran Lebowitz. Coming up, I'll be talking to Kara Swisher, Judd Apatow, and Jonathan Majors. You can find Talk Easy with Sam Fragoso wherever you podcast. After the past couple years, it's time for a different kind of conversation.